Well, hello, Barnes & Noble Book Club. It is really, really, really good to see everyone. Patti Callahan Henry, I'm so excited to meet you. And I realized I did something funky to my screen. I don't know what I did. And Shannon DeVito, my partner in all things books. I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Barnes & Noble's podcast, Poured Over. We are not taping this for the show. We are taping it, however, for B&N's YouTube channel, which we're totally stoked about. So if you want to come back and revisit all of this, you can, because here's where I remind everyone who's participating that there are spoilers in this conversation, y'all. This is, we go hard on the spoilers here. So if that is not your bag, we totally understand. We respect your reading choices. However, lots of spoilers coming. So just want to be clear about that. If you put in a question when you were registering for the event with Eventbrite, I have your questions. If you want to use the chat to drop in questions, you can do that. I'm going to be paying attention to the chat throughout this event, or you can use the Q&A module. If you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and hover over, you'll see Q&A and click on that. You can drop questions in there, and I will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat, and I have your questions. And for those of you who've attended the book club before, you know I like to work in your questions as we go rather than holding them all until the end, because it's way more fun when we can all participate. And I know we are all so excited to talk about the secret book of FLORA LEA. So excited. But before we get into the really fun stuff, Shannon, I know why we picked this book for book club, but why don't you tell the audience why we did what we did?
Yes, I am and many booksellers are suckers for books that celebrate the power of storytelling. And I think this is the type of book with its dual narration and multiple timelines that did such an amazing job really hammering home how important stories are to our lives and how they get us through grief and love and our lives as a whole. So I think Patti did an amazing job weaving the fiction and fantasy elements together, anchored in, real, true historical facts. And booksellers loved it. I loved it. And we had to have it. We had to have it for May. And that's why we picked it as our book club.
Okay, wait, before we get too deep into things, Shannon, will you just show the end papers again? We were swooning over them yet again. So I mean, come on, how great are these end papers?
Pretty.
When you're dealing with sort of all of the bits of story, right? And there's so much that happens in this book. It's also kind of nice to have an objet that's very pretty as well. Patti Callahan Henry, it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. But how did this book come to you?
Well, before we get started, I want to say what y'all just said. I am so excited to be here. I am so happy. And whoever made that video at the front end of this, I had tears in my eyes.
That's Harry, our producer.
Harry.
That's Harry.
Harry.
Thank you, Harry.
Mm-hmm. Harry, I bow to thee. I mean, I have seen those images because of my research, but I have not seen them put to a video like that. That was astounding. And if you missed it, y'all, you'll have to go watch it on YouTube, because that is a perfect visual for what Operation Pied Piper feels like. I also want to say to all of you Barnes & Noble readers out there, y'all have been incredible this month. You've been on my social media. You've been on the Friends and Fiction social media. You've been on the Barnes & Noble pages tagging, and I've had so much fun talking to so many of you. Okay, so now I messed up, Miwa. What was the question?
The question is very simple. How did the secret book of FLORA LEA start for you?
Oh, wow. So I think it's one of my favorite subjects, like where do stories come from?
Right.
And, I talk about it in the novel, but sometimes I can't point to a specific moment, but for this book, I can point to an exact moment.
Okay.
And it was when I was doing research for another novel of mine and was reading about Operation Pied Piper. And all those of us who know that children left the cities to move to the country, we knew that, but I never knew what it was called. I think most people don't know what it was called. We just know that children moved from the cities to the countries during World War II. And when I saw Pied Piper, I got that chill bump thing, because I'm a lover of legends and myths and fairy tales. And I remembered that the Pied Piper is not a really happy legend, as most fairy tales and legends are not. And so I became curious, and that's where it all began.
Okay, so lots of folks in the Eventbrite questions have asked where the names come from. So let's start with Hazel and Flora, and just let's give people, I mean, we've all read the book.
Okay.
But a little bit of insight into our gang of girls, because I mean, Hazel, heart and soul of this book, heart and soul. But let's start with the names. Yeah,
I think about her a lot. And then I'm like, oh yeah, the book is done. You know, I'll be driving along or taking a shower or whenever our minds get quiet, and I'll think she should say or do this. I'm like, oh, the book's already done. But I was very deliberate, as I usually am, about choices for names. And for this one, I was extra deliberate because I knew from the beginning that this book would be soaked in nature, that Whisperwood would be a place of escape, a place of peace, a place where the girls didn't feel exiled from their home, which is what they were. And so I wanted it to have names of nature. And then as I started to really get into the novel, I realized that I wanted some rivers in there. So Hazel, of course, is a tree. And her middle name is Mercy, Mersey. So and Mercy is a river in England. And Flora, of course, means flower. And her middle name, Lee, is also a river in England. So both of them have a name that is of the natural world and a river. And I chose both of those very deliberately. And yet Hazel and Flora came to me with their names.
Wait. Are you telling us that these women just walked out of the wilds and suddenly you had a book?
I did.
Okay.
Now it all started, I mean, I wish it was that easy, but I did. The very first scene I ever wrote was the scene where Hazel makes up the fairy tale for Flora Lee.
Okay.
I didn't have their middle names yet, but they came as Hazel and Flora, and Whisperwood came as Whisperwood.
Okay.
It's a hell of a scene to start with.
I know. Well, I knew, you know, when I found out the legend of the Pied Piper, which is that a piper plays a flute and leads children to their death. So what the heck? We named an operation to keep children safe after a horrible fairy tale, right? Yeah. So when I knew that Whisperwood would be a safe, natural world, and I wanted them in.
Well, and then later in the book too, we learn that Flora, when we discover that Flora has resurfaced, but that, you know, Maria, the American who essentially takes her story, said Flora would tell her this story to comfort herself. And I think that's a really important point to make, and just builds on everything that Shannon said earlier. And Patti, obviously everything that you're doing in the book. I think that's really powerful, especially for tiny people. And if you think about it, those of us who have tiny people in our orbits, you know, when you're reading them stories at night and they want to hear the same book 18 times.
Over and over.
And you learn to do the funny voices because you're like, okay, I'm the adult in the room and you want this book again and I will give it to you. But wow, I have memorized this entire picture book.
Goodnight Moon? What mother?
Oh, hi.
Goodnight Moon.
I'm just on the auntie status. And I got to tell you, there are plenty of books where I'm like, oh yes, I can. Pigeon drives the bus. I can, yeah.
You could do that front to back.
But here, okay, so let's go back to these women for a second, because they are wonderful characters and there's so many surprises in this book. I mean, okay, I figured Dad was going to die. No offense. Like, I mean, there's
it's war.
Yeah. You had to stress the family a little bit. Dad's going to die, but I got really attached to Hazel. And I got to say, our girl, in all of her grief and all of her guilt, she makes some bad choices. And boy, that bad boyfriend bugged me.
Oh, Barnaby.
Bad boyfriend. Oh man, bad boyfriend.
What was it with really with Hazel too? Her protectiveness of the story only being for her and Flora, that she just didn't want to share it. And part of that I think affected later in the book. But did you know that you were going to have her be that insular with just the two of them about that story? It's protection just for them and it's not for sharing, and then kind of have that growth towards the end? Or, you know, did she tell you that when you were meeting the character and kind of developing that scene?
Well, twofold. I want to comment really quick on Hazel and Barnaby and what she was doing and all of that, which is I was having Hazel carry around this like great grief and shame and secrecy about Whisperwood, which leads into exactly what you're saying, Shannon. So it was a secret, right? And so she carried all this guilt and shame that was completely unnecessary. And both Barnaby and Hazel were so damaged. And so it wasn't that I wanted to make him bad as much as if you have two very unhealed, probably a better word, two bad people who haven't done their healing coming together, it's not right. It's not that he's bad or she's bad, but both of them are carrying this guilt and this shame that is unnecessary, right? Hazel is carrying around this burden that she can't unload because, to segue to you, Shannon, it's a secret. And I knew that it would be a secret from the beginning, from the very first moment that she told it to her, because as they're exiled from their family, as they're sent away from everything that's comforting and lovely, their home, their garden, Mecklenburg Square, their cute little school, their best friends, as they're separated from that, they needed, in my imaginary world, which is very real to me, in my imaginary world, they needed something that was only theirs, just theirs. Nobody else could know about it. And when it was time to tell about it, like maybe, because Hazel thinks Flora went to look for it. At that moment, she could have said it, but instead, it's so much fun talking about it without spoilers. Instead,
it's easier too.
I know. Instead, she threw the pages in the river. Yeah. Right. She turned her back on this very important story, and then it reappears to help solve it. And I just felt that was important, Shannon, that it was such a secret that something wonderful turned into something shameful in that secrecy.
And we've got lots of folks asking too, which character so Dee Driscoll is asking, what character came to you first? There are other folks who are just like, how did the cast show up? So can we just talk about, I'm guessing Hazel is the one who really showed up first, but I don't know. I might be wrong.
No, Hazel and Flora Lee show up together, right? Okay. They show up in the back garden. Hazel is making up this fairy tale world for her sister. And for me, the two of them were one.
Got it.
Right. They drove the story. They showed up together. And that's why their separation is so heartrending, because they are as one, especially since they're sent away from their mom, which means they rely on each other even more. And then the other characters, the beloved Bridie and Harry and Barnaby and Kelty, like they showed up as needed. Right. So I have a very special fondness and attachment to Bridie.
Yeah, she's great.
She's just incredible. And I'm like, maybe she needs a story. She's just, her husband, there was no
I would read that.
Okay.
So Mary Beth Pomeroy, though, is wondering, who was the most challenging character to create in The Secret Book of Flora Lee, and why?
Who was the most challenging? I think the person that took me the longest to understand was Barnaby. Because I didn't want a caricature of him. Yeah. But also I didn't want to go off on a tangent about his life that took us away from the story that mattered. The other person that was took me a bit longer, none of them were hard per se, but took me a bit longer to get to know, is her half brother, Tenny. Yeah. And in some original versions, he was much, much brattier. And then as I got to know him, I'm like, oh, of course he's not. He's just the half brother of a union that Hazel didn't approve of at all. There's nothing wrong with him. Right. And he took me a little bit to get to know, but none of them were difficult per se. Sometimes characters, like their backstory and who they are, take a bit longer to emerge from the fog of the story.
It is your 17th novel. I mean, you have a little experience creating these worlds, but we've got a lot of folks too who are wondering what is it about historical fiction and what are the challenges? What's the research like? Can we talk about I know you alluded to it with Operation Pied Piper earlier, but that's not the only bit of research you had to do. There's a lot. And of course, you're doing that show, The 10%, right? You've probably done reams and reams and reams of research, but you use 10%. So can we switch over there for a second and talk about the process?
Oh, I love talk. So we need to extend our time.
Yeah.
I'll try to make this short and sweet. The first part of that, why do I love historical fiction? Because I love taking something you think you know about and flipping it on its head.
Yeah.
Right. Like you thought you understood about children were sent away from their parents to live in the country. I bet you didn't know what it was called. I bet you didn't know that they got on a train with a knapsack, a gas mask, and a luggage tag around their neck. I bet you didn't know that they had to go to town halls while parents walked around and went, I choose you. I choose you. I love pulling all that out and bringing it to life inside the story. As for the research, I love research. In fact, I have to pull myself back from the research because I will fall down a research rabbit hole in 2.5 seconds and emerge a week later without a single scene. So I have to be really careful about that. But I love it. And people ask sometimes if I have research assistants, or absolutely not, because for me, the story comes alive in the research. I'll find something that changes the story. For example, the Hamlet of Binzi, right? The more I learned about Binzi, the richer the story got, because Binzi itself is a story-soaked Hamlet, a story-soaked village. And so the more I do my research, the better the novel is. And for this novel, much of it had to do with the milieu of the 1940s and 1960s. I spent almost a month in England last summer visiting every single place that you read about in the book. I visited Mecklenburg Square, Bloomsbury, Cornwall, St. Ives, Binzi, London, Cecil Square, Antiquarian Bookshop. You visit there, I went there. And then the primary thing I did that was fascinating was read first-person accounts they call them self-evacuees, of child evacuees. And I actually was able to interview a 94-year-old evacuee. And so all of those stories were subtly woven into an amalgam of Hazel and FLORA LEA's experience.
Right. Yeah, I have to say the whole I choose you thing. I mean, I knew the evacuations had happened, but little kids are, whoa, that's a lot for a tiny person to process.
I mean, to sit on a bench in the town hall, and in the first person accounts I both read and interviewed, they said the boys who looked strong were chosen first because they could help around the farm or the house. And the cute little girls were chosen first. And then, but if you wanted to be with your sister or brother, you were often chosen very last.
Right.
So imagine you've just been torn from your family, you're carrying a knapsack and a gas mask, and you're sitting in a town hall while strangers are deciding your entire fate, whether to take you home. And I really wanted to imbue that experience into their story.
Lots of folks are wondering too what the biggest challenge is writing historical fiction, because again, you don't want to make it sound like you're writing a textbook. I mean, you got to put the story first, right?
Yeah. So for me, the biggest challenge is not showing you that I know so much more than you do, right? And there's so many interesting things I find while doing the research. I mean, 1960s England, for example, the Beatles are about to show up on the scene. The Stones, we have, Tara Brown, we have this whole 1960s London scene, music scene. So I think I snuck one scene where Peggy and Ren go to a jazz bar, but that was all I got in there from all this research I did. So, what I usually do, and hope I stick to it, is pick what the cornerstone of the novel is. Right. And then if what I've discovered is interesting, fine. But if it doesn't touch the cornerstone, or the keystone of what the
Yeah.
book's about, which is what happened to Flora Lee, then it has to go, sadly.
Do you
Shannon, what
find
was
that
your,
you,
oh, sorry.
oh,
What was your favorite moment, Shannon,
ooh,
from Flora Lee?
when Hazel, and I'm just jumping ahead to one of my
Mhm.
favorite parts because it was
Yeah,
the
yeah.
mystery of the whole book. So then when we finally got there, I was like, yes. When Hazel meets Dot and the the goosebumps on her and on me as she's slowly realizing it, and then trying to, just the connection described as their eyes are meeting and as Dot's taken aback, and it's this, this pattern of avoidance all the way up until this, and then
Yeah.
finally realizing that he's been here this whole time.
Ugh.
Essentially, like, I was like, this is exactly what I wanted. I didn't want it to be sad. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I thought Linda, actually, I thought Penny's mother, Linda, was going to turn out to be Flora for a second. And I was trying to figure out how you get a kid across the Atlantic during wartime. And I was like, I don't think I'm right. But just also Linda's personality being what it was and thinking the world is a terrible, scary place. I mean, she obviously has her own grief and her own reasons for feeling that way, but legit, you could see how a tiny scarred person would end up becoming an older scarred person like Linda. And I was just like, how is she going to pull this off? I have to say the reveal of Dot and Flora, that was very satisfying.
Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Very satisfying.
Okay, so I'll tell you a secret. Don't tell anybody else. But that wasn't my original ending.
Okay.
And when I realized that that was the ending, because it was built in all along, it was sitting there.
Yeah.
It goes back to Craft Miwa that you were talking about, which is this idea of trusting the story.
Yeah.
Because it was already, Dot already existed in the story. Like, I didn't decide later and then go put her in and just like shove her in these peg holes. She was already part of the story. And when I realized that, so on Friends in Fiction, we talk a lot about what is the story about and what is it really about?
Yep.
And when I realized that so much of this story is about who am I, when Dot would finally find out, this gives me chills every time I say it, and I don't get to say it much because I can't give it away, but when she realizes I'm looking for myself.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
I am looking for me, right? I'm on this obsessive search for lost children of Pied Piper, and I am the lost girl. I am the river child. I just felt like that was so thematically appropriate for the story and for all the characters trying to discover who they really are without the shame, the guilt, the bad things that happen to them, what other people tell them to be, whether it's Harry becoming an artist or Hazel letting go of guilt. They were all trying to find out who they really were. But Dot was literally looking for herself.
Yeah, I thought that was such a great twist. We've got a couple of folks asking too, in terms of finding yourself, right? Like we've talked about characters looking for themselves and whatnot, but a couple of attendees are asking, Once Upon a Wardrobe, like there's some similarities to that book. There's some similarities, obviously, with the C.S. Lewis novel, Mrs. Lewis and whatnot. And is this kind of, are these things you've been chewing on for a while? Did those books somehow inspire Flora Lee?
They did. I mean, I think that, okay, this isn't fancy, but I think we only have our own compost pile to work with.
I love that line.
Every author has their own compost pile.
I love that line.
And it's made a little bit of our past, of the things we love, of the things we question, of the things we obsess about in the middle of the night. So there's really no way that, unless I'm not paying any attention, there's really no way for one book not to lead to the next, because if someone mentioned Once Upon a Wardrobe, that was the book I was researching when I found out about Operation Pied Piper.
Got it. Okay.
Nothing in the Secret Book of Flora Lee has anything to do with Once Upon a Wardrobe, except for the fact, so that is where Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe come from.
Yep.
They come from Operation Pied Piper. And so I took that one little piece, pulled it out, and made up my whole world.
I was going to ask if that's as you're doing research and compiling, we talk about the 10% and just using just the smallest little smidgen of all of this amazing research. When you're working on all of these books, do you set things aside, like multiple things at once where you're like, I'm eventually going to go down this rabbit hole? Or is that like you land on one thing outside of the research, outside of the book you're working on, and you're like, this is it, this is the next one? Or do you have a kind of an array that you start to pick and choose from?
Oh, Shannon, that's such a good question because I think about that a lot. So if I find something I'm very curious about, what I've learned is that usually means there's a story hiding in there. So I will write them down, and no book is made, or no novel that I've written at least, is made of only one seed or one curiosity. Right. So in The Secret Book of Flora Lee, we've got a fairy tale, we've got a legend, we've got sisters, we've got the British countryside, we have mythology, Bridget, St. Fried's-Wide, we have Lewis Carroll's Treacle Well, we have, so many of the things that I'm interested in or care about wove themselves into this novel. And so yes, if there's something that really gives me that curiosity or that tingle, I start reading about it, researching it to find, and not always will I find that it's worthy of a story, but guess what? It might work its way into a different story. So I do keep a little running list on my desktop of read about this or check this out, or even a question, why is it called that? Right. And then I will dive into it. I mean, even the legend of St. Fried's-Wide in this novel is, I could have gone on. I had to pull so much of that out of the first draft because I find her legend outrageously interesting.
So maybe there might be possibly a novel. Okay, I'm not going to jinx it. Marie Montalto, I hope I said your last name correctly, and I'm sorry if I didn't. How did you first become interested in historical fiction? Because I mean, you've spent quite a lot of time in this space, and you're clearly comfortable with all of the different elements and playing in different times and all of that kind of thing. But something must have given you the bug.
I'd say I really wish I could stick to one time. I have an 1838 shipwreck, and then I have a 1938 post-war, and then I have, good Lord, Patty, pick a country and a time and just stick with it. But I have to go after where my curiosity leads.
Right.
And changing from more contemporary novels to historical novels about 7 years ago wasn't deliberate. Like I didn't sit down and say my top 5 goals for 2017 are to, go into historical fiction. What happened was I became incredibly interested and curious, one might say obsessed, with Joy Davidman, which is where my novel Becoming Mrs. Lewis came from. And I just couldn't believe that nobody had written a story from her point of view. Yeah. She was, I won't even start talking about her because that would take the rest of the time. And so when I wrote that novel and pursued that curiosity, it was all gates were open. Historical fiction was my jam, and I have not looked back for 2 seconds.
We've got a bunch of folks asking too about sort of maybe the personal bits. So is the character of Flora or Hazel any resemblance to someone you know or a family member? There's a little bit of that. There's also, well, let's start there. Hold on. I need to jump through some of this, but is there any bits of your personal story? Oh, I know what it was. Someone was asking too, the relationship between the two sisters as as Hazel is telling Flora stories. It seems like maybe that comes out of your personal experience too. So just tossing those out there.
Okay, so let me start with our Hazel and Flora Lee from any personal experience. So I'm the oldest of 3 sisters. My youngest sister is 11 years younger than I am. And so maybe some of that is in there. Like I said, we only have our own compost pile, but also I'm a mom of 3, and I read to my children and made up stories with them incessantly. And I am a grandma to 2. And so when,
Wait, what?
yeah. So
Sorry,
my
what?
daughter called me the other day and she said, she's reading the book.
Mhm.
And she has a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. And she said, you have to tell me if Flora Lee is okay, or I cannot read one more page of this book, because Flora Lee is Bridget. That's my granddaughter's name. That's where the name came
Oh,
from. For Bridie is my granddaughter is Bridget. And so I said, I don't want to tell you, I want you to read. She said, I can't. And then it hit me that maybe Flora Lee is a little bit of my Bridget.
yeah, okay.
This very toe-headed, connected to nature, wild. I'll come just shy of feral child. And so, yeah, I think that some of those things work their way into the novel, and the idea of creating something beautiful for a child you love, whether it's your sister, your granddaughter, or your daughter, and then that thing possibly being the thing that takes them from you. So I had to tell my daughter that Flora Lee was fine and to keep reading.
I can understand being stressed out about that.
Yeah.
Jessica Herrera is wondering, is there a scene that was the most fun to write? And is there a scene that was the most challenging to write? And it feels like building off of oh, this might be my granddaughter is the perfect place to drop that question in.
Well, hi, Jess. Jess is my co-agent. I'm so happy
there
you're
you
here.
go.
Let me see. The most fun to write was the opening scene where
Okay.
Hazel makes up Whisperwood, because as soon as I did that, the story just went like, not that it was easy to write. It still took me years. It was still complicated. I still almost quit, like I always do, almost quit in the middle. But that scene was so much fun to write that I was able to use that energy to keep going, because I realized not only was I going to be able to create a fictional world for my reader and for me, but I was going to be able to create a fantasy world for my characters.
Right.
And how much fun to do both at the same time. And the scene that was the most difficult for me to write, wow, Jess, way to stump me on Zoom. I think that the scene that was the most difficult for me to write was the one where Peggy's mom shows up in England. Once again, she was a difficult character for me to understand. You know, that super protective, doesn't let her daughter leave the house because you want to hate her. Like, well, she's an absolute nutter, right? Like, she's a true nutter. And I needed to have some sympathy and empathy for her. And so I think I wrote that scene more times than I would have liked, to get the balance where Peggy can forgive her mother and we can have even the slightest, the scene where she sits in that chair in the lobby all night waiting for her daughter to come home. That's when I knew, I get her. It's going to be okay, right? I can not make her just the, caricature of a nutball. I can have her, sitting up straight, dressed up in this chair in a lobby all night, waiting for her daughter to come home. And then when she does come back, begging for forgiveness. So that was a really difficult sequence of series, but also in the end, incredibly satisfying.
Yeah, Brianne Lewandowski is asking, the book seems to be a mix of mystery and family drama. Did you know you wanted to mix these two genres, or did one come first?
Oh, that's a great question, because I don't think about genre when I'm writing. And there's a great book, and I think he's incredible, The Anatomy of Story and the Anatomy of Genre. And we've interviewed him a couple of times. And I just think, I wish I thought more about that on the front end. And I'm trying to give more thought to that now in the front end, so that you can kind of hit on those. But the story comes for me as such a priority that if I try to put a pin in the genre too quickly, for me, I will start to get formulaic. And as you can tell, if you've read this novel, which you're on the call, you probably did, but you can tell that I didn't stick to a I mean, we go in and out of a fantasy world. We go in and out of 1940 and 1960. We meet Dot, we meet Peggy, we meet her mom. So if I had really thought which genre comes first and which genre comes second, it might be a completely different kind of novel. But for me, it was from the beginning, the mystery of what happened to Flora Lee.
Okay, I want to riff on a question that an audience member dropped in, but Shannon, I'm coming to you first, and you'll understand why in a second. Courtney Bailey is wondering, what would you say has been the most formative fictional story of your life so far?
Oh, wow. That's so good.
Shannon,
I want
know
both of you to answer.
I kind of have an answer, but it shifts. But I want Shannon to start, and then I promise I'll answer it, Patty. But we're starting with Shannon, then we're coming to you. And I'll
Shannon, I'm dying. That is such a great question.
It's a great question. So Courtney, I hope you're in the audience, because this is an Eventbrite question. So I'm hoping Courtney's here. But.
Yeah. So this is a little bit off the board for 50, because it's a great book and I love it so much. It's not one of my favorite books of all time, but it kind of changed my perspective, was Wide Sargasso Sea, because I had already read Jane Eyre, obviously, and it really shifted for me this idea of perspective. And, Wicked, the Gregory Maguire, where it's all about who's telling the story.
Who's telling the story?
Yeah.
Who's telling the story? That was one of the first times in my life, truly, as I was in middle school, high school, really figuring out this importance of perspective growing up. So probably Wide Sargasso Sea, which is a phenomenal book. I haven't read it in a very long time, but it's not in my top 10, but it's a book that I treasure because I think it taught me that.
I love
that's my answer. Yeah.
And I think that's what I was talking about with getting to know them. It all depends who's telling the story. So if Ren is telling the story of Peggy's mom, she's just nothing but a nut.
Exactly.
But if we can slide in behind her and see why she is the way she is, maybe we can understand. Oh, I love that. I don't think any of you will be surprised by my answer, but
which is,
I think probably the most formative for me was as a child, and the way I viewed the world as this liminal space between the seen and the unseen, the visible and the invisible, is Narnia.
Yeah.
And then as an adult, I would say it was Beach Music, which opened my ears and my heart, not only to the South, which I moved to in college, but also to the lyrical language that can draw you into a novel and not freaking let you go. How about you, Miwa? You're not getting off the hook?
No, I'm not. Oh, no. I'm certainly not. But so it shifts for me. I will totally own that it does shift for me. I don't have a permanent top 10. But there are a couple of story collections that I've been really thinking about a lot recently. One is Self-Help by Lori Moore, which when that voice popped, and I was in high school, I think, when I read that. And I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know short stories. You come out of Dubliners, right? You come out of, just the way literature is taught. It's just, Self-Help was one of those books where I was like, more, please. I need more of this right now. And just noticing too, some verbal tics that I have that I think I can point to her. It's a little trippy when you pick something up, right, and you're an adolescent and you're just like, oh yeah, more of this, please. And Edward P. Jones, Lost in the City. Those are the two where I'm just like, oh man, the stuff that you can do with story and people, and I am right here with you. And I just, right now, those are the two that I'm just like, I just remember how much they shifted me as a person the first time I read them, and they still hold up. That's the best part.
Hold on to you too.
Because here's the thing, sometimes you go back to a book and you're like, yep, not okay. I understand where you fit in my world, and I no longer need to keep this copy of this book. Thank you very much for your service. Bye-bye. I'm sorry, we've all had those books where you're like, I remember, love it.
Whoops.
Yeah. No.
I feel different
I respect
now.
and honor the woman who read that, but by
And
Yeah.
now and now we're gonna send this off into the world. But can we also talk about some of the challenges though of being a working writer? We've got some folks who are saying, well, how do you do this when the world is, being the world and things like that? I mean, you're sitting here, you write what, a book every couple of years?
Every
Do I have
couple
your
years.
cadence right? Yeah. So I mean, it's a lot. So you've got the research and you've got the travel and you've got the world building, and world building is a phrase that I insist we have to take back. It doesn't just belong to sci-fi and fantasy.
No,
Every
we have to do it
novelist, every
too.
short story writer builds a world. So let's not,
Yeah.
but all of the work that goes into this and the thoughtfulness and the characters and everything, how do you balance it with the rest of your life? I mean, it is your job, but how do you do it? Because it's a lot of emotional labor.
It is. It's such a multifaceted answer, but I will start from the beginning that stories and books have for me been a sanctuary and a place of rest and of escape my entire life. They have been a place where the world makes more sense, and where when I emerge from reading them, I understand the world better, or I can see with new eyes, or I can notice things better. So they've always been a place to emerge from, not as an avoidance, but as kind of traveling between worlds. And so the writing is the same for me. When I sometimes give a talk on writing, and people ask, what do you wish you had known before, when you first started? I will say that I wish I hadn't believed that I had to keep my creative life and my real life separate.
Right.
The more that we let the two come together, the better both are. So I consider the work, like the hard work, the sitting at the desk, the getting it done, answering the emails, PR, marketing, tour, all of that. I don't even necessarily call work, although that's what it's termed. It is such a part of my life, the creative work, that to try to separate them. And I have a big life. I have kids and grandkids and friends and travel. But I think it's all wrapped up together. And people will say, you must be incredibly disciplined too. I'm just incredibly obsessed. I don't know about disciplined, but if I'm losing track of the story, or I have a story idea, I can't do anything but sit down and do it. So I think the answer at its heart is just a mad love for story.
And we appreciate that mad love for story, don't we, Shannon?
Oh yeah.
There are worse loves. There are worse loves.
Oh,
like coffee.
Oh, hi. Linda George is wondering, did you find out who decided to call it Operation Pied Piper? And she's also wondering how many of the children who had to leave knew the tale and were additionally traumatized by it. I think you have additional reading resources in the back of the book, but did you ever find out who decided to call it Operation Pied Piper?
No. And if somebody has any connections with the British government, I sure would like to know why they named an operation to keep children safe after a horrific German legend. So if somebody could call
the reading ones,
the prime minister, there you go. Call the prime minister and ask who in the government did that. I would love to know.
Well, that part I can't answer, but we have a lot of folks wondering what the next Patti Callahan Henry book is going to be. Do you feel like you can talk about it a little bit, or are you one of these folks who don't talk about books until you know where you're going and what's happening?
Oh, the minute I know where I'm going, I will tell you. I just don't know where I'm going. I mean, I'm definitely working on a new novel, and I definitely am very obsessed with the main character. And yet to try and talk about it right now would, number one, deflate it for me. And I'm really unsure how to even unfold it in a way that makes sense. But the minute I know what it's about, I'm very open about my writing process. I'm working on my social media, and I will begin talking about it the minute the minute the fog clears.
Okay. And Mary Curry has asked this a couple of times. If Dot's story was the new ending, will you ever tell what the original ending was?
Yes, I have no problem telling what the original ending
well, then
was.
Here we go. Mary, here's your answer.
Drum roll.
Dun-dun-dun. Okay,
the original ending, Peggy was FLORA LEA.
Yeah. And I'm really happy that Dot was the one, because also I think it's really, okay, I'm talking about fictional characters again, like they're real
No,
people.
you're not. They are very
Everyone knows I
real,
do
Miwa.
this, but the idea that Dot is wrestling with the fact that she has two families
Yes.
and that she's like, that just felt super true to me. And like, because obviously, like, she's not going to, even though her Aunt Imogen could have been punted into the sun, but granted, we wouldn't have a novel if we punted her into the sun. So, okay, fine. But I like that conflict. I like that nuance, and that like there is no black and white.
Yeah.
Okay, Imogen really did drive me around the bend, but there's no black
Well,
and
she
white,
actually
right?
was a nutter.
Yeah, she was.
actually
But I mean, the way you talk about Linda too, it's like, yeah, Linda is the woman who's just, she's so caught up in her own grief and her own pain and doesn't know how to give her daughter the space she needs because she's just terrified. Like that's an exhausting bummer of a way to go through life, right?
Yeah.
So just all of these little moments that you give us, right? And yeah, okay, Harry's really dreamy. Yay, we got a
Yes,
happy
he
ending.
is.
That was great. I'm delighted Harry was dreaming, but you made us get through the bad boyfriend first, man. Ugh.
Yeah,
I
we
mean, and
did.
yes, for the purposes of story, delightful, but bad boyfriend. man.
Well, and also and also because I wanted to show that in many ways it's Hazel's fault too. Right?
Yeah, she yes.
needed to heal. She needed to go after what she wanted. Here she is. She wants to write, she wants to create, but she won't. So she works in a bookstore. She collects notebooks. She collects antique pens. She sits in coffee shops and listens to writers talk about writing, but she won't do it.
Yeah.
And so same with a man, she won't open herself up to any of that. So I needed her to blow past all of it.
To stop being on the perimeter of living. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, Shannon, I'm writing that down.
Right.
Okay.
That is a good line. But also we are talking about the 1940s and the 1960s. And, you know, we all, as, you know, members of society, we've all developed new language. And like, I mean, if I think about my grandparents and my great grandparents, like, no one is talking about feelings. Oh no, like that is feelings. What are those? So the idea that we're in, you know, Hazel's orbit as she's figuring this out with no one really to model herself on, we got to give our girl a little bit of credit. I mean, that's not easy. That's not light lifting, right? It's,
Miwa, when I interviewed the child evacuee, she's 94.
Right.
She told me the whole story. She remembered everything. She told me about it, the family she lived with, what happened to her brother, blah, blah, blah. And I said, did you ever talk to your brother or your mother about it? Like, did you share your experiences because she had been torn from her brother? Never, not once.
Wow.
Yeah. Shannon, what do you miss most now that you have read Flora Lee for the first time? What do you miss about this world and these women? And because the men are nice, but let's face it, this is the women.
I read it for the women. I read it for the sister relationship, having sisters myself. Honestly, it was the world of Whisperwood, and it was that fantastical. It's just reinforces this idea that you can escape to a safe place, even if that safe place is fiction. And that's what this book was just in general. It's a safe place to escape to, even though it's anchored in reality. So there's a feeling of hope throughout the whole thing that I love and miss. So I, can't wait for the next one.
If you miss Whisperwood, maybe we have to go back there. I don't know.
I mean, we've all heard people I've been watching the chat, and there's some folks in the chat who wouldn't mind seeing a little more of Bridie. And, I mean, someone asked in the Eventbrite questions too, if maybe there was going to be a sequel with Hazel and Harry. And I'm just
never
sitting
saying
here,
that.
I'm letting you drive. You drive. I'll.
I just want to be a passenger.
I'll come along
for
the
a
ride.
minute. Just
okay. All right. Well, listen. I knew this was going to happen. I knew we were going to run out of time because this is what happens when we do B&N Book Club. Patti Callahan,
ran over again.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for giving us these characters, because how much fun was this? I mean, seriously.
Y'all, you're the best. This has been. Just been an enchanting month. Your readers, all of you, Barnes and Noble, I bow to your everything that you have done for this book and to the readers who have responded to it. I am
Well,
I am the luckiest.
we're all pretty lucky because we get stories, right? We get stories and we
Yes.
get community. Like, I think people forget that reading is actually an active community. It's not a solitary thing, right? You
Yep.
might physically be reading on your own, but reading is an active community. And I think, it's kind of nice to remember that. Anyway, so also folks, if you want to join us on July 11th, because July 4th is the next Tuesday and we are not getting together for book club on July 4th. Sorry, I will be on a plane.
Get outside.
But yeah, July 11th, we have Luis Alberto Urrea for Goodnight Irene. So if the secret book of Flora Lee was your thing, I think you should come back and join us in July. But Patti, we cannot wait for the next book. So, when you're ready to talk about it, we'll see you again, right?
All right. You guys are awesome. Thank you
Okay.
so much for having me.
Thank you. And
Thank
thank you
you.
everyone for joining us. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.